foreign military sales of arms from the United States. Does anyone know what the difference between direct commercial sales and foreign military sales are? Not quite. Go ahead. We'll come back.
Direct commercial sales are like when you just sell it. It's like when a company is selling it to like a person. And military sales, I don't know this one.
Really? Yeah, basically. We'll cover it more in depth. So we have direct commercial sales are selling directly to people, whereas foreign military sales are directly to militaries and governments. So the kind of big question is, who do we sell to? Here's a cool little chart that explains how do I get this bigger? Who we sell to and how much. So you'll see one of our biggest arms sellers, who we sell arms to, is Saudi Arabia, followed by Australia, the UAE, Iraq, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, Qatar, Israel. You won't really, some of these countries you won't really see talked about too terribly much because there's not as much lit. Like Australia is probably not a very common argument or country you'll see talked about, but like Saudi Arabia, for those of you who were in for the topic lecture earlier, that was a lot of what he talked about. South Korea and Taiwan are pretty common countries you might see a lot. But you can see we kind of have a wide array. But this will kind of be interesting because as you see from this resolution, you can kind of pick whatever country you want. It's pretty broad and big. So, but that doesn't mean every single country ever will get read because there's probably not much of an advantage to how many arms we sell to like, gosh, I can't even really think of an example of just like a tiny, teeny country. Just there's not a big advantage to it. Luxembourg, sure. So these are kind of who we sell to. So the difference from direct commercial sales and foreign military. So direct commercial sales is the sale of government licensed defense articles and services from U.S. firms to private individuals. So it's the government selling it, but to things like private military contractors. That's one of the biggest ones. So it's not like we sell it to the Israeli government. We sell it to individuals and private companies that are operating within other countries. And then we have the foreign military sales, which is government to government, i.e. the kind of United States sells a lot of arms to Saudi Arabia and Israel. So those are kind of the big ideas of what we're going to be talking about. I'm going to move on. I'll move on to the kind of arguments you might see common in debate. So when we read like affirmatives, we have different advantages, different benefits to reducing the arms sales. You'll see a lot of arguments about human rights and credibility, for instance. People will make arguments that the AF we're going to be reading for the policy lab says that we should stop selling arms to Saudi Arabia because they've done a bunch of human rights violations and they've like done a lot of, they hurt journalists, they lock activists up, a bunch of stuff they do that's really bad. So we say that it is necessary to stop human rights abuses because those arms sales directly fuels them. This might go on into a credibility argument about like, if the United States is willing to work with countries who do human rights abuses, it makes us look less credible. And it makes us look less like we know what we're doing, or less countries will want to model our actions based off of the way that we mess around in other ways. So human rights and credibility. You might see arguments about an arms race. Does anyone know what an arms race is? Go ahead.
Like countries do like make weapons as fast as they can.
Yeah. So it's like, we all know what the Cold War was, right? It was a big race between the United States and Russia to see who could have the biggest, strongest military. Arms races are a really important part of that, kind of building up the weapons you have and the technology. And people will make arguments that when we contribute to certain countries getting weapons, it creates an imbalance, which makes other countries want to build up their own military systems, which only increases the risk of tension, of miscalculation, which is when you kind of misunderstand your enemy's actions, and you might accidentally go to war over something, or if there's a miscommunication about something. So arms sales directly contributes to that because it creates that imbalance. That kind of leads to like an argument about stability. If we contribute arms sales to places that are already unstable, it might increase the level of instability there. So you think there's a lot of countries where there are revolutions. A lot of these will kind of blend together, you'll notice, but they'll end up having some distinct words and differences along the way. But if we contribute to a military such as Saudi Arabia that does harmful human rights violations to its people, that could create instability because there might be uprisings or revolutions or just general chaos, which could create wars, civil wars, violence might spill over. Think all these border controversies where there are lots of refugees that are flowing out, and that creates hardships on economies, and it makes it more likely to have governments kind of freak out and go nationalist and protectionist in ways that are really bad, which also kind of leads to regional war. I'll do more examples later on as we kind of talk about specific countries, but Israel is a very good example of United States sells a boatload of weapons to Israel that they then sell throughout the region, and it creates tensions and flashpoints. And say Israel and Iran, they don't like each other, they don't get along. There's always kind of a risk of tension, and if there are more arms sales to them, that could spark and go nuclear, which would be really bad. And it would draw in other countries in the region because there are different alliances, networks that all kind of blend together. You might have a relations advantage that's just like, maybe our relations with Israel are hurting because we sell weapons to Saudi Arabia and the status quo. And Israeli relations are really important to maintaining peace in the region or solving disease or something along those lines. So as long as we keep selling weapons to Saudi, it really pisses off Israel, and we need to be able to stop that to fix those relations. So that could happen with a bunch of different countries. We could have a country politics advantage. Ignore the kind of soft left for a second. So this might be an example for a Taiwan app. Taiwan currently is like a really weird limbo of whether or not they're their own country, what role China has over them. But there are a lot of what are called hardliners. They're very their opinions are very strong about how Taiwan should react to China. And they might use arms sales as a means to garner votes and garner popularity amongst people. And if we remove arms sales, it gives them something not to campaign on, and they might lose. And that would be a good thing because it prevents conflict. So individual countries might have their own reasons why politically it would shift based off arms sales. Democracy promotion is another one. A lot of countries that we give, this kind of ties to human rights, a lot of countries that we give arms to, obviously are not the best when it comes to democracy promotion. They're human rights abuses. If we remove one of the means that they use to hurt their citizens, that would obviously increase democracy because they're less likely to lock up journalists and lock up activists, which means they have a chance to kind of get reforms to happen and have protests and all that kind of stuff that might increase democracy. And democracy is super important for preventing war, human rights abuses, all these kind of different impacts and cool things. Terrorism is another advantage you might see people talk about. So there's a lot of ties from Saudi Arabia and Iran that they are tied to different terror groups in the region. And by selling them arms, there's kind of a spill out of those arms to those terrorist groups. So if we remove those arms sales, that might remove some of the funding and the backbone of terror groups, such as Al-Qaeda, ISIS, all sorts of things. All right, now I'm going to come back to soft left. Does anyone know what that term means? No. Okay, so a lot of the things I just talked about are pretty I'm a war hawk. I'm a neoconservative. There's a risk of war. We got to be hardline against these opinions. And they make these big impacts of nuclear war, terrorism. A soft left AF is kind of a little a little more liberal, I guess I would say, in its way that it talks about things. So instead of being like, ISIS is really evil and we need to remove arms sales to prevent them from doing terrorism, a soft left AF is a little more like, hey, the way we talk about terrorism is like really bad, but we should still remove arms because it allows countries to enact violence and be real terrorists. Or you might make an AF that says that arms sales contribute to militarism in the region, like the security, the military-industrial complex. Have we all heard that term before? It's kind of like the military controls everything and it's really mean and evil to people. So by removing arms sales, it removes a method by which they maintain militaristic tendencies. So it kind of decreases tensions and peace in the region. It's much more like how does it benefit the United States and more about kind of how does it benefit society as a whole in a more like liberally social justice-y way. You might say like arms sales prop up the capitalist industrial complex and that makes capitalism exist, and capitalism is really bad because it increases poverty and global warming. So we need to remove arms sales to get rid of capitalism to try and solve those things. So it's a little more on the social justice-y versus policy, very hardline stance. Does that make sense? Anyone have questions, comments so far, ideas you might think be aligned with this? Yeah, so this topic is very like, there's a wide variety of countries and arms that we could talk about, but a lot of them lead to very similar impacts and arguments to it. So there might be like distinctions between what kind of weapons we sell, but it will often lead to kind of the same endpoint. Anybody else have questions so far? Okay.
Actually, I have a good question. So with immigration last year, all these different for education or for jobs, is there something similar to that with this topic? Like I know there's
yeah, I'll actually get to that later. I didn't save my file before opening up, but when I get to the topicality section, we'll talk about it then. All right, so we kind of talked about the countries that we do sell arms to. Some of them have specific scenarios you might focus on. So the Ukraine, obviously, everyone knows what happened at Crimea, right? Can anyone tell me? Go ahead.
Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula.
So basically, they said this is ours. We're taking it. Russia is aggressive and revisionist and wants a lot of like. Russia is aggressive and wants to own a lot of territories for themselves. But there's a lot of conflict in the region. So we sell arms to the Ukraine in order to kind of counter against Russia. So an act would be like, we need the arms sales only inflames tensions and makes it worse, which could lead to a Russian war. They might also make an argument about Ukrainian democracy, that removing weapons was necessary to let democracy kind of flourish. I kind of explained that earlier. So yeah, those are kind of two basic arguments under the Ukraine. Australia is a country we sell a lot of arms to. I think this is another one of those acts that it's like, you probably will not see very often. It might have really wonky arguments to get it to an impact. They might just be like, it's key to preventing some other country from being mad. But I'm pretty sure you won't see a lot of that. India is a country. So in the topic lecture, I know he said that India was less developed to discuss, but I think there's still some apt room there. So obviously the Kashmir region has a lot. Does everyone know the Kashmir region? Anyone want to tell me what that is? Go ahead.
No, it's a place in northern India or wherever you are. That has been basically Pakistan, China, and India have all been warring over that region.
Yeah. So yeah, in 1948, Britain used to own India and said, we can't afford this anymore. We're gonna give it back. But they drew a line between Pakistan, India, and then China's in that region too. And it was drawn by like a lawyer who had like never been to India before. And the way he drew it, he tried to keep it Muslim majority and then Hindu majority. But there's a bunch of places that are like fought over and there's a lot of tension. So that's the Kashmir region. And AF would be that arms sales only inflames that region and makes it specifically ignite in the Indo-Pak region. So kind of notice how it's one of those bigger arguments that's just applied very specifically. So that's also where China comes in. China also has border disputes. A really interesting fact about this, actually, so we all know what Google Maps is. Google Maps shows the...
Whatever country you're at, they'll, like,
Yeah,
show
it'll
you
change the
different
borders, whether it shows
Mhm.
it's part of China or part of India.
Yeah, but there's actually been, I think, twice where Google messed up who was showing what, and it actually almost caused a war. Because like this is huge regional tension because Google showed the wrong borders, the wrong country. They like freaked out and they were about to ignite a conflict. Thankfully, it didn't happen, but really weird, cool fact about how things that like you're like it's Google Maps. How could that cause a war? But maybe. So human rights is another thing. There's human rights abuses that occur in India. They're like obviously not as bad as like say we talk about Saudi Arabia, but there's some lit about that. India in the Kashmir region treats like the government, not Indian people themselves, but the government often treats the Muslim minority there very poorly in the region. So the arms sales kind of emboldens them to do that more. We talked about Iraq in the earlier meeting. Who can tell me the difference between the formal and informal alliance that you kind of talked about earlier?
Oh, so like a formal alliance is something that you have a treaty that's like passed by the United States government, and an informal alliance is basically like you haven't really signed any type of treaty because like maybe either country doesn't want to like actually tie, but there's still like the way you act with each other is an alliance.
Yeah, so Iraq is one of those. We use arms sales to kind of use leverage. Same with Iran. I don't know if I put that on there. So these countries, historically, we've used leverage to kind of push them to do things other ways. So a lot of the similar examples I've made earlier about like human rights abuses and regional instability would apply. I'm going to kind of copy, paste, apply, just in specific scenarios a lot this year. So it seems like the topic is really, really big, but really it is just kind of like specific applications of the same few arguments. So Israel is another country that's going to be talked about a lot. Back to that soft left app that I kind of talked about, you'll probably see a lot of that, where people will be like, Israel specifically uses arms to hurt Palestinians. The Israeli government uses arms to lock up, incarcerate Palestinian activists in the region, because there's a lot of conflict, obviously, over another instance of Britain drawing lines, places with other countries where it didn't really reflect the internal divisions and politics and religions. So it's kind of a hot mess there right now. And there's a lot of conflict and fighting, and arms sales directly fuels that. So the removal of arms sales could prevent the Palestinian human rights abuses. But there's also some more of those war is going to happen style asks. So Israel and Iran don't get along at all. There's always concerns that one of them will strike the other, and that Israeli arms sales allows them to kind of maintain tensions and risk conflict and starting wars, and vice versa. So that's an example. And just a general Middle East stability. A lot of arms sales that go to Israel then sells to other countries within the Middle East, which can recreate those arms races we talked about, miscalculation, tensions, all that kind of jazz. Any questions so far? Are we good? Following along? What's up? So, like an app could end arms sales that they would then use to sell elsewhere. Does that make sense? Well, so an app would be like, we are barely maintaining peace right now. And if it continues, it will build worse and worse and worse. Or an app might just be like, it literally just takes 1 moment, so we need to stop it ASAP. So instead of increasing it, we just need to like tamper it now while we still can. That makes sense? Okay. So the next country, Japan, is one that will be talked about a lot. So Japan and China, obviously, they have a lot of fights over the region called the South China Seas. There's a bunch of little islands throughout the kind of like the ocean between them that they both claim as their own territorially. China also likes to just kind of claim islands that don't have people on it to try and put military weapons on them to kind of act as a buffer. So that obviously could increase those kind of tensions and risk of war. So removing arms sales would reduce like the tensions, would make China feel a little less threatened and like make them kind of pull back and fall back and would help decrease the tensions. Same thing with North Korea. North Korea doesn't like Japanese weaponry systems, particularly how the United States is what is bolstering it, because the United States and North Korea don't get along very well. That's a kind of a running theme. You'll find a lot of countries don't get along. So removing arms sales might make North Korea less scared and less on edge and willing to kind of pull the trigger on a nuclear weapon than if the weapons are still there. So next we have Qatar. It's going to be very similar to kind of the Saudi Arabia arguments we made, but Qatar is really important for Middle East stability. All of their arms sales, there's tensions between the regions. They want control over certain areas. So removing arms sales would help decrease that instability, very similar to other arguments. And then terrorism is an argument that can kind of apply here. There's Control F to Saudi Arabia too. There's like official reports, and the U.S. government believes that Qatar and Saudi Arabia too use a lot of their arms that they get to contribute to local terrorist groups. So by removing arms sales, it reduces the ability for them to give terrorist weaponry. So it would decrease the risks of terrorism, whether that be like cyber terrorism, nuclear terrorism, chemical, biological, what have you. And then Saudi Arabia, this is the affirmative that the policy lab will be reading. Okay, people, you'll have your section, I promise. So Saudi Arabia, the act talks about Yemeni conflict. So Saudi Arabia uses a lot of the weapons that they get to bomb and drone innocent civilians in Yemen, and that's obviously increasing tensions. In the first place, bombing civilians is probably just a bad idea. That's kind of one of those soft left ideas where we're just like, we shouldn't bomb people. It's not very nice. We shouldn't like let that happen. Alternatively, that increases conflict, could increase civil war, increases the risk of draw-in from great powers such as the United States. Russia's has a vested interest in the region, China, so it could lead to draw-in and lead to global nuclear war. And then we have like Iran. It's a very similar kind of, they often fight over local territories. There's the Strait of Hormuz, which is a really important body of water that they use for trade, and they're always threatening to cut it off and prevent the ability to use that strait, which could lead to conflict because it's really important to oil transfers and just different types of trade. So by removing their ability to shut down the Strait of Hormuz could help ease tensions. Could also prevent what are called oil spikes, which is when the price of oil just randomly skyrockets and jumps, which is pretty bad for the economy. Unpredictability is never very good for markets. So you could have like an economy style argument and have that typed in. But next is South Korea. South Korea is going to be incredibly similar to Japan in that they have conflicts with China and they have conflicts with North Korea. And the United States backing them is like super duper important to maintaining their power and creating tensions in the region. It's very simple. Taiwan is kind of very similar as well when it comes to China in particular. So Taiwan is in a very weird legal space because they were owned by Britain and they're slowly kind of getting added back to China. But there's a lot of, they're much more democratized, they're much more Western in Taiwan, and a lot of them don't really want to become part of China and be under the Chinese government. They're currently kind of autonomous in a lot of ways, and they don't want to be returned, but China wants Taiwan back for all of their own, so there's a huge source of tension. So like the United States currently we recognize, but we don't officially recognize Taiwan as an independent state, but we do consider them an important ally, and we provide them a lot of arms. So people will make arguments that arms sales increases the risk of war in Taiwan because there's conflict over the region. There's maybe a U.S.-China relations argument, very tied in, but U.S.-China relations could be important for like economic growth. We do a lot of trade with them. It could be important for working together on any manner of relations things. We're two of the biggest countries in the world. We're pretty useful for creating different treaties and stuff to maintain like control, to maintain global peace. And then a China politics argument. I kind of talked about that earlier with the kind of hardliners thing, where currently Chinese hardliners that really want to go to war use the arms sales as a kind of like campaigning use. They're like, look how evil the United States is, that they're doing this thing that's going to increase tensions. So it gives them a platform. And if we remove that platform, they might lose, which means they could maybe democratize their government or be less likely to go to war, kind of things like that. Turkey is going to be very similar to a lot of things we've talked about earlier. They're very implicated within like Middle Eastern politics. Turkey and Iran don't get along together very well, and that increases risks of tension. Turkey and Russia, our presence in Turkey and helping them also makes Russia really mad because they're in that region. So it could lead to instability and violence. I know I'm getting very repetitive. I promise we'll be done with this section too soon. The UAE, the United Arab Emirates, can be similar to most of the other Middle Eastern advantages you'll see: instability, war. Egypt is another country you might see some asked about. So the Middle East area has an arms race, and contributing to that makes it worse. You also have kind of those democracy-style arguments we talked about earlier. And then there's the UK. I don't think this will be seen very often, but you might get some arguments about like NATO and how contributing arms to the UK pisses off Russia, might lead to Russian war with NATO. Okay. So those are all mostly government-to-government sales, the kind of foreign military sales. We also have the commercial sales. A lot of these are going to be, again, very similar to what we've talked about. But we talked about private military contractors, PMCs. So private military contractors that often do the work of the military, but they're not officially like a government group. They often increase insecurity in the region. A lot of countries don't like that we have PMCs, which decreases relations. PMCs are also like awful about human rights abuses. So those are various spin-offs that you could go to because they're not subject to a lot of the same rules that militaries are. They're kind of like their own separate legal thing. Do you have a question?
Yeah, so PMCs, are they American troops in a way, or are they citizens?
So that's an interesting question, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But it could be, an act could defend that United States PMCs are topical or allowed to be talked about. But for the most part, it will be other countries' military contract groups. Israel is a very big group where they have a lot of commercial military grade things.
So you could call those weapons.
Yeah, so I actually, like I said, I have a section on this I'll get to about what is a weapon, what isn't, what counts.
Okay.
Instability and revolutions, a lot of these are going to kind of tie under PMCs, but letting non-government groups get weapons can increase the risk of them having a revolution, which could increase instability and make things worse. Human rights abuses, kind of already covered. Okay, that was the act stuff. Does anyone have questions, comments, confusion? I know it was a lot of very repetitive and boring things. Sorry. We will move on to disadvantages. So negative things about reducing arms sales. So the first is like a hegemony or a defense industries dissad. Can anyone tell me what hegemony means? Go ahead.
This might be wrong, but isn't it when countries try to gain as much power as possible by taking over other places?
Pretty much right. It's basically the like an attempt to maintain strength. It can be hegemony can apply to a lot of things. So like the English language is hegemonic, and that it is kind of all powering, and we are attempting to spread it globally. Culture can be hegemonic. How many McDonald's exist globally? But when it comes to the military in particular, hegemony is our military strength by the United States. So people might argue that arms sales are necessary to maintain our military strength, and military strength maintains peace and stability globally because they're able to prevent countries from lashing out, or they can do, some arguments are about humanitarian work that the military does. And then you have a defense industries dissad. It's part and parcel, but slightly different. Obviously, if we stop selling arms, that's going to, our defense industry is huge. The amount of money that our military weapons people make is massive. It props up it's a fair amount of our economy. So by removing an avenue or a market for them, it could hurt the defense industries, which is a sector of the economy that could have, could implicate other sectors of the economy, kind of spills on and on and on until you have economic decline, which can lead to war, conflict, poverty, food shortages, any number of things. Then we have like alliance dissads. So we talked about how we use arms sales as a means for maintaining alliances. If, say, we have Japan, and I say that our alliances is based off arms sales, and if I remove arms sales, it's gonna like hurt our alliance. It's gonna make Japan kind of freak out, and they're gonna feel like we aren't protecting them anymore. So they're going to proliferate nuclear weapons. Does everyone know what proliferate means?
Yeah.
Yeah, so like expand, have more, kind of like a slippery slope. So they think currently, because we back them up, they don't need to be aggressive in the region because they have us kind of, we're the like standing over their shoulder or their bouncer per se. But if we back away, they might kind of, this can apply to just about any AF. So like I said, the topic seems huge and unlimited, but you have certain generics like the alliance dissad that will apply to just about any AF that you read. You just have to make any AF that's read. You just have to make sure it is specific to that country. So you have North Korea, South Korea, Israel. Any one of these countries may perceive our arms sales as being super important for their safety, and if we remove their safety net, they might act irrationally and act out. Deterrence dissads. Does anyone know what deterrence means? Or the deter. Does anyone know what deter means?
Prevent someone from doing something.
Yeah. So deterrence theory is the idea that we can prevent other countries from acting out by means of military weapons or actual military strength. There's a bunch of different things that could be used to deter other countries from acting out. If we remove something, for instance, Israeli weapons are necessary to prevent lash out between Iran and Israel. Iran currently will not attack Israel because they know that they have our weapons, and they know if they attack us, then they will get attacked back, and it will be even worse for them. So if we remove arms sales, it removes the deterrence for Iran to attack. It increases the likelihood that they will attack and kind of increase the risk of war. Does that make sense? Then we have terrorism dissads. Some of these arms sales might be necessary to fighting terrorists within different regions, whether it's like Northern Africa, which Africa is a region as well that we have arms sales to. It is, oh man, it has a specific country. Oh, Nigeria is a very common, we sell a lot of weapons to Nigeria. So a lot of those kind of instability arguments. Those arms sales might be necessary to preventing them from spilling out and getting weapons technology and leading terrorist attacks. Does anyone know what the term circumvention means?
Basically just to go around.
Yeah, to go around. So if we remove arms sales, Israel, Europe, and then we'll see Russia and China all have booming defense industries themselves. So a country might just say, well, if you won't sell it to me, I can get it elsewhere. there's another market for that. So not only is that kind of just a like, you can't solve your own arguments thing, but also it could lead to those other countries' defense industries being bigger, giving them more power. So for instance, Russia is a disad you might see a lot. So right now, Russia does not sell that many arms because we provide the market. But if we pull out from the market, it would increase Russian arms sales and create a vacuum that they would fill. And that would allow Russia to expand and to try and do things more like in Crimea, counter against NATO more, like it makes them stronger. China's another country, you'll see that a lot. Hold on, I have an example of that too. So right now, Chinese arms sales are not very strong because of the United States market. So if we pull out, China would then increase that and could increase their ability to attack, like over the South China Seas we talked about, or the Korean conflicts that are going on. Does that make sense? So those are a lot of the common disadvantages you will see. Can anyone tell me what counterplan is? Yeah, so if the app says we should reduce arms sales to X country, the negative can get up and propose an alternative plan that might solve what the app is trying to do, but through a different means. So like, if I say I'm hungry, I want to go to Chipotle, someone could be like, counterplan, why don't we go to Taco Bell instead? So you're trying to solve the hunger by a different way. So there are different types of counterplans we could do. An agent counterplan is basically, so we said the United States federal government should do X. The agent of our plan is the United States federal government. They're the ones that are doing it. It could be Congress, whatever. An agent counterplan does the plan, but by a different actor or agent. So if I said Congress should do the plan, an agent counterplan would be like, no, the president should issue an executive order to stop doing X thing. Does that make sense? Agent counterplans. They're not going to be as common because they don't really make a whole lot of sense on this topic, but they're just like, you might see a random, like the DOD should internally decide to stop selling weapons or something like that. Delay counterplans is literally what it says. We'll do the plan, but in a couple of months. So we have disadvantages that are specific to like the upcoming election, for instance, or often they're about certain legislation that are in Congress right now that I could trade off with. A delay counterplan would be like, we'll just do it, but in a few months, so it happens after the election and doesn't affect the election, but we still end up doing the plan, so it's still solved anyways. Theoretically, an AF, the term should, like the United States federal government should, implies immediacy. So an AF is supposed to theoretically be done as soon as the plan is stated. So, but that is a theory debate that people can have, which we'll dive into smart. Another one you'll see a lot of are consult counterplans. So consultation counterplans are literally just, we ask another country how they feel about the plan. So if the plan is like, hey, we should reduce Japanese arms sales, a counterplan would be like, all right, let's talk to the Japanese government first about how they want to do it, whether or not we should do it. Like, let's give them a say, and it could increase their confidence in the plan. They feel like they are a part of the process, and they can get involved. Conditions counterplans are basically doing the plan. So if I am like, I'm going to reduce arms sales to Israel, a conditions counterplan would be like, we will only sell weapons to Israel if they stop doing human rights abuses. So we will end up, there could be an increase in arms sales, but if and only if they stop doing the bad thing the app has talked about. Does that make sense? Okay. Oversight counterplans might just be, so right now, you'll find out as you read the Saudi app, is that we have a lot of things in place. We actually have conditions that are like, we can't sell arms to certain countries with human rights abuses, but we don't have the necessary oversight or like groups. There's just too many. They don't have the ability. So an oversight counterplan could increase the amount of congressional oversight over certain arms sales. Different bodies could come together to like individually check each arms sales and be like, all right, as long as it meets these particular things. So it could decrease bad forms of arms sales while still maintaining the good kind. Because that'll be some arguments you'll see where it's like, certain arms, yes, we shouldn't sell them, but there are some we should keep and maintain. Advantage counterplans, I spelled it wrong. So if I'm like, we need to get rid of arms sales because of human rights abuses, an advantage counterplan would be like, I want to solve human rights abuses, but by increasing funding to democracy promotion in the country. You're like, we need to keep arms sales because they're good, but we agree we need to solve human rights. We're just going to find a different way to do it. And then uniqueness counterplans. These can be talked about kind of later. They're a little more complicated. We'll do that individually during the counterplan lecture. All right, and now we go on to the critique section, so our friends from the K-Lab can feel a little less left out. So I've talked a lot about how we're going to have nuclear war, and these countries are really mean and evil, and we need to counter them. A lot of criticism, it's spelled with a K because that's how the Germans spelled criticism. This is where you get super social justice-y and super like, hey, we need to look at our ethics, we need to look at the way we learn about things. We saw the question, what is epistemology, on that like exam. Epistemology is how we know things, how we come to learn things. So their criticisms on like a lot of the arguments will be from a lot of arguments will come from think tanks that are funded by the military. So obviously they're biased to go one way or the other. Just kind of different. Let's look at how you came to the conclusion you did and say why it's bad. So a security critique basically is criticizing the way that we approach international relations. The U.S. is very willing to be aggressive, and we're very willing to call out when we think someone is bad or evil. For instance, Russia, we're like, oh, they have meddled in our elections. They're very aggressive. They're going to go and create conflict on us. A security critique would be like, the only reason Russia is aggressive in the first place is because the United States has demonized them, has made them. Has anyone in here played Risk? How about this? So in Risk, you kind of move pieces around. You try to steal countries. As you build up your people in one country, if it's next to somebody else's country, they're going to start freaking out and be like, oh, are you going to attack us? You're mobilizing. You're building more and more weapons right next to my border. Hold up. No, we're not going to do this. And then you start to attack. So it's kind of a cyclical self-defeating thing. So people will make arguments about that. People will also make arguments that by doing the plan, it is merely an attempt to make the United States look good. So like the human rights credibility argument. The United States also does a boatload of human rights abuses, right? Like we incarcerate boatloads of black folks for non-violent crimes. We have really bad freedom of the press in the status quo because of our president. Lots of things that we do that are really bad. Why do we get to be the end-all be-all of what is a human rights abuse? And by making us look more credible in that arena, it only justifies the kind of violences that we do as being acceptable forms of violence. We're like, the form of violence I do, it's not okay. And usually it's often, we use the term racialized, and that when white countries or Western countries do these kind of atrocities, we look the other way. But when it is black and brown countries in particular that do these, a lot of the countries that I've listed have all been Asian countries. A lot of them have been Middle Eastern. We specifically are like, you can't do it, but we can. So it creates kind of a imbalance, a racist imbalance based off an attempt to maintain security and peace. But is it really peace? Which kind of brings me to my next point. This is positive peace. The idea of we ended a war, so now everything is peaceful. But there's conflicts ongoing all the time that often the United States has caused. Think all of those proxy wars that occurred during the Cold War. So when we were fighting Russia, we were like, we're going to go to Vietnam and just duke it out in Vietnam as opposed to having a big nuclear war. So it was peaceful at the time for us because in the United States and Russia, war was not happening there. But to assume that peace is just a single event when there's obviously like other conflicts that it's like, what do we decide is a war and what counts as it and what doesn't count? And it kind of leads to that like small violences are justified because it's not a big giant nuclear war. We can take away people's civil liberties because it prevents someone from blowing up a nuke. And it's like, what should we prioritize in that world? A nuclear war might probably not happen. There's probably a really low risk. So the way that we prioritize what impacts we talk about in debate. Capitalism critique, I kind of talked about that earlier with the soft left act, and that people will make arguments that arms sales, by removing them, it kind of props up United States hegemony, and it allows us to kind of market out capitalism as being the end-all, be-all. The next is Orientalism. This is a very specific subset of kind of the security critique and how we discuss Russia, how we discuss typically the Middle East and then China. So it was created by a dude named Edward Said. You'll probably learn this more in the K-Lab. We'll probably go over it in regular labs, where we're like, we have demonized, so we have this like image of what we think the Middle East or China looks like, and it's usually stereotypical, it is very racist, and it is often, when it guides the way we make policy, it can make bad policies. So when I was earlier like, oh, China is really aggressive in the South China Seas, kind of ties into that, like, it makes them more likely to be aggressive because we think they're evil. It's just like kind of goes back and forth, when really China is just trying to live their life and trying to feed their people and maintain like stability in their own region would be an argument that you could make. Russophobia, with Orientalism as well, it covers the Middle East. A lot of terrorism discussions apply to that. When you can think of it even locally, when a Muslim is engaged in like a terrorist attack, the media tends to be like, paint all Muslims as being terrorists. The way they talk about it is really much different than, say, when like we have a school shooting and the shooter's white. It's often portrayed as a lone wolf. He was very I'm trying to think of what words they use, like emotionally distraught, blah, 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 comes up with justifications for that to be true, whereas that doesn't often apply to Middle East terrorism, things like that. Russophobia, kind of already talked about, the way we demonize Russia makes them angry at us. And then a big section is is a bit of an old school term, but the global versus local debate. All of these arguments are obviously taking place on a very large global scale. We're talking about Middle Eastern politics, Chinese politics. A lot of critiques will be like, we can't do anything about that until we fix our own house. We can't fix the lawn, we can't fix the roof until we put out the fire inside the house. I can't remember what the analogy actually is. So we can't focus on big global pictures until we look at localities. And this kind of will tie into identity critiques. Particularly think the Israel Act, when people are like, oh, well, we are really mean to Palestine with our arms sales, so we should remove them. An argument might be that we have learned the violences. This will be in the K-Lab. You'll learn about this a lot more. The violences that Israel has done, they learned from us when we enacted violences on Black folks through slavery and through the prison industrial complex, all these kind of things. They learned it from us. So until we fix it internally, they can't fix it externally. Does that make sense? People might talk about queerness like that in the ways that so there's a really specific author, her name is Jasper Poor. When it comes to Israel, she talks about how when we try to prop up and make Israel solve their human rights abuses and make them look good, it only kind of sweeps them up under the rug more. And they have been kind of portrayed as like very gay friendly is one way that people talk about it. So it makes them look nicer, the government look nicer than they actually are. It kind of pink washes is the term, makes it look less violent. A feminism critique will often be talked about. The nature of weapons are often, there's links that talk about how like nuclear weapons in particular look very phallic, or the way that we talk about war ignores kind of sexist violences that happen on a like material day-to-day level, kind of things like that. All right, I'm gonna close this out and reopen it. I have one last section and then we're done. What's up? Yeah, that's what I'm about to do. I can get this to work. So that's actually an interesting tie-in. People will often debate about where your sources are from. Usually if you're having like a topicality lecture, it's a little less of a question because kind of everyone is reading the kind of same evidence. Like they're all assuming the kind of same ethical world, I guess. Does that make sense? But that is something that we'll talk about. I'll probably be done in like 10 minutes. Okay. Okay, so we'll kind of break it down word by word of what will be important. What's up?
Sorry, I want to just do a quick question. So do you think that psychoanalysis work as well?
I'm sure psych, yes.
I just
Well, psychoanalysis is kind of critical theory. Have we all heard of Freud? It's kind of a like leap off of that looks into like individual psyches for why they make certain decisions the way they do. And psychoanalysis usually argues that they're either kind of always hyper-focused on death in a way that's really bad, or hyper-focused on sex in a way that's really bad. It's a very basic explanation. We'll probably, I know the K-Lab will probably talk about it. Varsity Lab, we're going to break it down more. Novice Lab could probably worry a little bit less about psychoanalysis. It's kind of one of those more like high theory nonsense kind of things. Nonsense.
Do you think that this year, like, Agamben and biopolitics case are going to be a big
Yes,
thing?
those are slightly under security critiques, which is why I didn't really like specify them. But yes, definitely the notion that we can reduce arms sales and solve war kind of ignores the broader structure of how biopolitics functions and how we control life and death and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so the words that'll be important to this topic. The first is substantial. So the United States federal government should substantially reduce its arms sales. This is where a lot of the topic looks really big, but people will read. So topicality, for those of us who do not know, if the resolution is about arms sales and I get up there and I talk about whether or not we should sanction Iran, those are two different topics. They are not about each other. I, as the negative, would have no way to debate that. It would be super unfair and not educational. So we read topicality if we think someone's argument is not in line with the resolution. If we think they're talking about something that is off topic. So topicality, the word substantial implies that it has to be a big change. There's like a boatload of definitions of substantial. There are definitions of like substantial means 50%, substantial means a lot, substantial means 20%. There's a lot of different variations, but substantial is kind of meant to prevent an act from being like, we will stop the sale of a single weapon. There's just one weapon, there's one gun, and we just won't sell it. Because that's really impossible to predict, right? Really small. It doesn't change a lot. Debate requires a big change from the status quo in order to get offense and arguments based off of that. Whereas if we only got rid of one gun, that's very small and we can't predict that. So substantial is a way. Reduce is a word you might see. Reduce could mean to prevent something from happening. So a ban. Reduce could also mean to not prevent. So reduce just means you have to get rid of some of it, but you can't totally get rid of it. Modify is another term that gets paired with reduce, where it's like Hen and Af just add oversight? Does that actually reduce the amount of weapons that get sold, or does it just add a step in the process? Would that be topical or not? So now we get to like different types of weapon systems. Realistically, there's just going to be one term I'll focus on. It's dual use. A lot of people are going to say dual use weapons are weapons that can be both used militarily, but also for other uses. So space is a very good example of a lot of satellites and stuff like that have military capabilities, but they are also used for communication systems. You think GPS. So it is dual use, and that is both civilian use and military use. A lot of people say that that will not be topical, that it has to be purely military use. Next question, what are arms besides these? There's a big debate about what will constitute arms, and there is no clear answer to this. Topicality debates will be very unique and interesting because no one truly agrees. It's all very definition specific and who wrote them. If I have a card that's just like Joe Schmo said that arms are this, but my opponent has a card that's like the military defined arms as being X, you're probably going to prefer the military's definition over Joe Schmo's definition. So the kind of context is necessary to looking at it. So some people will say that arms are both military goods and services, i.e. like we sell weapons training, we transfer different types of military services. Some people might think that includes services. There are certain definitions that say it don't. There's going to be a lot of back and forth in this. So this definition says that arms does not include small arms. So we talked about the difference in that topic lecture of like guns versus big military tech. Some definitions say it does include small arms. So there's a lot of back and forth of what counts as an arms. And as we do more research through the 2 weeks, we'll kind of pin down more about how we understand what an arm is. And then the last thing I'm going to cover, and then I'm kind of done with this little lecture, is the word from. So I believe you asked, I think it was you asked me about somebody, about like, can we sell to our own PMCs? From is where that kind of question will get answered. To reduce arms sales from the United States kind of implies that it has to be someone that is not the United States that receives those weapons. So generally an act will say that stopping arms sales to a United States military base would not be topical because you cannot, like, selling to and from yourself doesn't really make sense from a debate context. But some people will argue that it counts. So it really will depend. And different people, topicality is very opinion-based as well, who thinks what is topical. So it will all just kind of come down. It'll be very debate-specific. Sometimes you might read reduce means eliminate in a debate, and then the next debate you read the opposite topicality argument. So it really changes from time to time. Any questions, comments, concerns, ideas? Cool, that's basically what I have. So.
And can you email us, or is this available?
Sure I can. I don't. Yeah. Just mostly like, yeah, that's fine. It'll be available. Oh well, we also have the video available as well. So. Okay. Then from now we're gonna split up into our labs again. Real quick.